Hello, everyone. So, ever since the Netflix movie about Ted Bundy came out, extremely wicked, shockingly evil, and vile, there has been renewed interest in this book, The Phantom Prince: My Life with Ted Bundy by Elizabeth Kendall. And I think at one point this book was for sale on Amazon for $500 because it has been out of print for a really long time. And because of the interest in the story again, the book will be going under or getting reprinted in 2020. However, that is still several months off. So since I've had a copy for a while, curiosity killed the cat. I did not pay $500 for it. That is a little too much even for me, but I really wanted to know what Liz's side of the story was. So I bought a copy, and I thought I would just do a reading of it. Not a review, just a reading. So for those of you who are curious about what she has to say, what the book is about, you don't want to wait until the book is released. I'm so impatient like that, so I can understand. If nobody has any interest, I'll just end up taking the video down. I don't know how many videos it's going to take for me to read all of these, or through this, because it's not a very long book at all, but I am just going to do probably 15-minute increments at a time. So I'm going to dive right in with chapter 1. Monday, March 1st, 1976, I sat in a cold courtroom in Salt Lake City next to Ted Bundy's parents. It was snowing outside. Ted sat at the defense table with his attorneys, waiting for the judge to return with the verdict. I stared at the back of Ted's head, my mind filled with memories of things we had gone through together for the past 6 years. Ted Bundy was on trial for the attempted kidnapping of a young woman, Carol DeRanche, from a suburban shopping mall near Salt Lake City. She identified Ted as the man who, posing as a police officer, had lured her into his Volkswagen, handcuffed her, and tried to crush her head with a crowbar. Her attempted abduction had been linked to the disappearances and murders of several young women in the Salt Lake City area. And the Salt Lake murders were linked to the 8 murders of young women in the Seattle area during the first 7 months of 1974. Ted and I met in Seattle in October 1969, became lovers, and continued an intense relationship until September 1974, when he moved to Salt Lake City. Even now, a year and a half later, we were far from finished with each other. Since the summer of 1974, I had been tormented by fears that Ted was involved in the murders in the Seattle area. Finally, I had gone to the King County Police with my suspicions. They told me they had checked Ted out and eliminated him as a suspect. But I continued to worry, and in January 1975, I talked to the police in Salt Lake City. They also told me he was clear. Now I knew that I had been terribly mistaken, that my Ted could not be guilty of these horrible crimes, but that I had set in motion machinery of the law that could crush out his life. Judge Stuart Hansen entered, and we all stood. There seemed to be no air in the room. I find the defendant, Theodore Robert Bundy, guilty of aggravated kidnapping, a first-degree felony. Ted's attorney asked that he be allowed some time with his family. We entered the judge's chamber where Ted was frisked and his hands cuffed behind his back. I put my arms around him and told him I was sorry. He was drenched with sweat and stiff with tension. I kissed him on the cheek and whispered, "I love you." I hated myself for what I had done to him. In July 1979, I watched Ted again as another verdict was read. This time, the trial was in Florida, and I was seeing it on TV. This time, I was sure that Ted was guilty as charged, guilty of raping and beating to death 2 young women as they slept in their Florida State University sorority house, and of severely beating 3 others. I knew he was guilty because of what he had told me in a 2 a.m. telephone call in February, just after he was captured in Florida. The Florida prosecutors had visited me in Seattle and asked me to testify against Ted. I had at first agreed, but the more I thought about it, the more reluctant I became. I still cared about him very much, and I had worked very hard at putting my life back together. I was sure the defense could make mincemeat of my testimony and of me. I had never been named in the press, and I valued my anonymity. My sex life with Ted would be a subject of great interest, as it had been to all of the investigating police officers. I was a recovering alcoholic, had not had a drink in 3 years, but people would only hear the word alcoholic. The prosecutors had told me my testimony was vital and that they would protect me from attacks by Ted's lawyers, but I reminded them that in our 2 a.m. phone conversation, Ted had specifically refused to talk to me about the crimes in Florida. He was trying to arrange things so that he could be returned to a prison in Washington state and be near his family and friends. I asked the prosecutors why they didn't bargain with Ted, offer him this in exchange for answers to questions about the murders of young women in Washington, Oregon, Utah, and Colorado. In a heavy southern drawl, one of them told me, "Mr. Bundy is bargaining for his life. We're bargaining for his death." I couldn't be a part of it. They saw Ted Bundy as a murderer. I knew him as a lover and a friend. I was threatened with extradition if I wouldn't cooperate, but finally the matter was dropped, and I never heard from the Florida prosecutors again. It took the jury only 6 hours to come in with a verdict of guilty. I can count on 2 fingers the times Ted threatened me or was the least bit violent towards me. Yet I feel that I have lived through a violent time. I have spent too much of the last 6 years thinking about beatings, strangulations, rapes, the outrage of the brutal deaths of innocent people, and my own guilt. The untrue things that have been written about me and my relationship with Ted are a different kind of outrage. This book is an attempt to rid myself of both nightmares by facing them down. I left Utah in 1969, 24 years old, and not pleased with the way my life was turning out. On the surface, I was doing all right. I was in my last year of college at Utah State, getting good grades, good enough to make the dean's list. Not bad, considering that I'd been suspended for disciplinary reasons a few years earlier. My 2-year-old daughter, Tina, was a great joy to me, and since she was the first grandchild on both sides of her family, I had help and support from all 4 grandparents. On the other hand, my brief marriage to Tina's father had been a disaster. While I was relieved when our divorce was final, I was now acutely embarrassed about being a divorcee. I spent a lot of time trying to figure out what was wrong with me, that I couldn't make my marriage work. I'd been given all the tools anyone needed to lead a successful life, but somehow I had managed to screw up. My dad was a respected dentist in Ogden, 30 miles north of Salt Lake City. My mom had been a nurse until my oldest brother was born, and then she became a dedicated stay-at-home mother. Our family wasn't active in the church. We were considered Jack Mormons, people who were Mormon in name only but didn't follow all the church's rules. But I still knew that our ancestors had walked across America so that we could be Mormons. Mom and I prayed together when I was little, and I grew up knowing the power of prayer. I also knew that if you forgot to be grateful, God would get you. By the time I got to high school, all I wanted to do was spend time with my boyfriend, Ben. He had a black MGA sports car, and when we weren't out riding around in it, we were washing it, waxing it, and cleaning the wire wheels. We went skiing every chance we got, the ultimate in teenage chic, as we tooled around the road in the shiny black MGA with the skis on the back. Ben and I went steady all through high school. We were going to get married as soon as we graduated and have a baby and name him Stein after Stein Erikson, a popular ski racer at the time. My parents had other ideas. They told me I needed a college education. I told them they would be wasting their money because all I wanted out of life was to marry Ben and start having babies. They won, and I went off to college. I went through sorority rush and was dropped at the end of rush week. I hadn't really wanted to be a sorority girl, but I was surprised at how much it hurt. I figured it was my shyness that had done me in. When I was with my friends or with Ben, I talked constantly. I loved to laugh and make Ben and my friends laugh, but when I got around strangers, I could never think of anything to say, or I would say something really stupid and relive it for months. I turned red when I was spoken to, and the more I fought it, the redder I would get. I began to party a lot, my grades crashed, and at the end of my freshman year, I was suspended. I also broke up with Ben without being able to tell him why. Ben and I were strongly attracted to each other physically, but we had decided early in our relationship that we were not going to go all the way until we got married. In the spring of my freshman year, I went to bed with a man for the first time. Not Ben, but Jim, the man I eventually married. When the marriage ended, I was on my own. I had always been half of a couple, first Ben, then Jim. Now I was alone with a young daughter and needed to start over. Utah didn't seem like any place for a single parent, so I started thinking about moving. Angie, my friend since junior high school, had just had a bad experience as a VISTA volunteer, and she was looking for a fresh start too. We considered San Francisco, where my sister lived, but decided it would be too sophisticated for us. At quarter break, we went skiing at Sun Valley, met some guys there who were learning to set up a ski patrol for a new resort near Seattle, and were easily persuaded that Seattle might be the place. I even had a cousin living there, and I figured that having some family nearby would soften the lump in my throat feeling I was having about leaving my family in familiar territory. I had to stay around long enough to collect my degree, so Angie went on ahead by herself. I hung on in Utah until fall, when I decided it was now or never. Chapter 2. I fell in love with Seattle at first sight. My brother and his wife had pulled a U-Haul trailer with all my belongings behind their car, while Tina and I followed in my VW Bug. We came into the city early one morning over one of the long floating bridges that crossed Lake Washington. It had been raining, and the mist was clinging to the tops of the evergreens. Everything that wasn't gray was green. There were sailboats on the lake, hills all around, and the University of Washington off to the right. I could hardly wait to get going on my new life. Tina and I stayed with Angie and her two roommates in her Capitol Hill apartment until I found my own place. The city was a new world to me. There was water everywhere I looked. Lake Washington to the east, Puget Sound to the west, Lake Union in the middle, and a canal with locks that connected them all. Losing my sense of direction, I kept confusing one body of water with another. The street numbering was worse. There was one street called 40th Northeast and another called Northeast 40th. Within a few days, I found an apartment I could afford about 12 blocks from Angie's. I hadn't realized that rent would be a lot higher than in Utah, and that I would have to pay the first and last month's rent in advance, along with a cleaning deposit. The place wasn't much, a one-bedroom first-floor apartment in a 1950s building that looked like a motel. It was furnished with a turquoise Naga-hide couch and matching chair, a Formica coffee table, and not much else. The kitchen was the size of a closet, and the refrigerator was the size of a TV set. On one side was a tiny lanai from which I could look up at the tall building next door. Tina, who had just turned 3, would have to sleep on the couch until we could afford something better. I looked for a job right away. My degree in business and family life wasn't going to impress anybody, but I thought it could get me a good secretarial job. The University of Washington was my first choice. I was used to being a student, and I was encouraged when the university personnel department sent me for an interview at the medical school. As I walked out of the personnel office, 10 or 12 police cars full of men in riot gear roared by. Trying to find my way across the campus a few minutes later, I came upon a huge construction site where a crowd was milling with picket signs. Suddenly, a great howl went up from the crowd as some black men pushed a bulldozer off the edge of a 100-foot deep pit. As it crashed to the bottom, the riot police moved into the crowd. I stood clutching my map of the campus, lost. When I finally arrived for the interview, I was nearly 45 minutes late. The man who interviewed me, and later became my boss and my friend, told me not to worry about it, that the kind of thing I had just watched happened on the upper campus, that down here in health sciences, things were a lot quieter. What I had seen was one of Seattle's most violent civil rights protests, an angry demand that more blacks be hired on the construction project. My interview went well, and a few days later I was hired as a secretary in one of the university's medical departments. Within a few weeks, my life in the city was taking shape. Not having grandmothers around to take care of Tina was a problem, but I was able to find a good daycare center in the university district. Some mornings, Tina cried when I left her, and I didn't like the way I felt either. I thought it was important for mothers to mother their children, and wondered how I could do a good job of mothering when I was at work 8 hours a day. I called my parents a lot, and I wished I could drop by for Sunday dinner, but all in all, I was pleased that I had started my new life. Money, as always, was a worry. I counted my quarters and dimes carefully. One Saturday, I put my clothes in a laundromat washer, and Tina and I went across the street to visit with Angie. When I went back to put the clothes in the dryer, I found a parking ticket on my windshield. I leaned against the car and turned the ticket over to see how much the fine was. $20. I was sitting at Angie's kitchen table, still crying about the damn ticket, when one of her roommate's boyfriends came in. "What you need," he said, "is a night out. Let's find you a babysitter and go out and get rowdy." It didn't solve my money problem, but it sounded good. Angie's place was headquarters for a bunch of people we knew from Utah and their boyfriends and girlfriends. By nightfall, we had organized a party to celebrate my parking ticket. When Angie and I got to the Sandpiper Tavern in the University District, our friends had started to gather. It was dark inside. People were dancing on an elevated dance floor to a jukebox stocked with Beatles and Jimi Hendrix, looking as if they had strolled out of their sorority or fraternity houses dressed in jeans and sweaters. It wasn't so different from Saturday night back home. After 2 beers, I decided that this was exactly what I needed. After a few more beers, I didn't even feel shy. The last bits of shyness disappeared when a tall, sandy-haired man invited me to dance. I had already sized him up from across the room. He looked a little older and better dressed than the rest of the crowd. I figured he must be a graduate student or maybe even an instructor. "Do you come here often?" he asked as we danced. "No," I said. "This is the first time I've been out since I moved to Seattle." He asked the inevitable from where, and I thought of saying San Francisco or some other place that sounded classy, but I admitted to Utah. "Utah?" he exclaimed. "Isn't that in Wyoming?" We laughed about where Utah really was, somewhere around the Great Salt Lake, and carried on as strangers in bars do till the music stopped. I danced with everyone who asked. Drinking and dancing go together, and every time I came back to the table, the beer tasted better. I kept trying to catch the sandy-haired man's eye, but he was usually dancing with somebody else. We smiled at each other across the floor a couple times, but he didn't ask me to dance again. Later in the evening, a skinny young man asked me to dance, and I did, even though Angie and I had been joking about his taste in clothes. He turned out to be a creep, and looking for a chance to escape, I saw the sandy-haired man sitting by himself looking sad. I headed for his table. "You look like your best friend just died," I said. He looked up surprised. I said, "You look lower than a snake's belly in a wagon truck." "Is that how you folks from Utah talk?" he said. "What do you call yourselves? Utonians? Utah Heights?" "Utahns," I told him in my best hick voice. He laughed and I sat down. He asked me if I was a student. I was tempted to say yes because I didn't like telling people I was a secretary. I told him I worked at the university, but then I found myself telling him that I made heart valves in the instrument department. I could feel my face turning red, so I started blabbing about living in Seattle for only a couple of weeks, about it raining all the time, about the riot I had seen on campus, anything to keep talking. He wanted to know why I had moved away from Utah. I told him briefly that I had been married, that I had a daughter, and that my marriage had ended. I explained that Utah was very family-oriented and that I felt out of place there. He asked me why I didn't consider my daughter and myself a family. "I guess I do," I said, "but the rest of Utah doesn't consider us a family." "Actually, I just moved here myself," he said. "I've been living in Philadelphia and going to school at Temple, and now I've moved here to go to law school." He had a distinctive way of speaking, not really an Eastern accent, but more like a British one. His name, he said, was Ted Bundy. I knew when I first looked at him, before we had even danced, that he was a cut above the rest of the crowd. His slacks and turtlenecks certainly weren't from J.C. Penney, and the way he moved projected confidence. He seemed to be in control of his world. Sitting across the table from him, I was surprised at how easy he was to talk to and how easily we laughed together. He had a smile that made me smile back and beautiful clear blue eyes that lit up when he smiled. He had thick eyelashes, a strong jawline, rich curly hair, and a nice body. When he told me he was only 23, I couldn't believe it. He said he didn't realize he had been looking sad. He was just thinking about leaving. The couple at the next table got up to go and offered us their unfinished pitcher of beer. I said I was never one to let good beer go flat. Ted wanted to know where I'd been around Seattle. "You haven't been to the public market? We should go there sometime. You'll love it." The chemistry between us was incredible. As I watched his handsome face while he went on about places to go and things to see, I was already planning the wedding and naming the kids. He was telling me that he missed having a kitchen because he loved to cook. Perfect. My prince. The pitcher was empty and the crowd was moving on. I invited Ted to come for coffee with my friends, and he said sure. Since he didn't have a car, he would come in mine along with Angie and a couple of other people. When we stepped outside, the rush of night air made me realize how drunk I was. We couldn't find the cafe we were headed for, and as the glow began to dim, Angie and the others decided to go home. When they got out of the car at her house, Ted moved into the driver's seat and drove me to the babysitter's house to pick up Tina. The babysitter was wearing nothing but overalls, and when she bent over, you could see right down to her navel. I was embarrassed, but Ted didn't seem to notice. He scooped up the sleeping Tina and carried her to the car. I drove, and Ted held Tina in his lap. Ted was doing most of the talking now, and I was beginning to feel very sick. He was writing a book on Vietnam, explaining how the cultural differences between Americans and Vietnamese contributed to the war. I was a little surprised and a little skeptical, but I was mostly concentrating on driving the car and not throwing up. The closest parking space was 2 blocks from my apartment. Ted carried Tina in and gently put her to bed on the couch. "I don't think I can drive you home," I said. "Why don't you just stay here?" I was so sick, all I could do was to take my shoes off and fall into bed. I remember Ted, still dressed, lying down next to me, then the room turning wildly. I hung one leg over the edge of the bed and put my foot on the floor to make it stop spinning. Then I slept restlessly. I knew Ted was up and walking around the apartment part of the night. Once I opened my eyes and saw him standing next to my dresser, looking at my bottles of perfume and things. I wish I hadn't left my birth control pills out, but I wasn't awake long enough to imagine what he must be thinking. And that is the end of chapter 2. Let me know if you want me to continue reading this book. Like I said, it is not a long one. Has short chapters, so should be able to finish it. That way you don't have to either buy the book when it comes out if you don't want to, or wait for the book to come out in January of 2020. All right, everyone, that is it for this weekend. I will see you in the next video. As always, thank you for watching, and I will see you next time.